How many hours a week should an aspiring junior tennis player, particularly let's say at under 14 or 14 and under, be doing in order to become a professional tennis player? Right, straight away I will acknowledge it's a bit of a clickbaity title, as if I'm going to give you, it is 16.35 hours per week. I'll give it to you right now. There is no answer. There is no answer. If I said, I would sort of judge between 10 and 15 hours, someone would say, well, this player developed and all they did was 8 hours. Or actually 90% of the pros on the tour started at 6 and they were training 8 hours a day. And I don't know that those stats are anywhere near correct, so don't take me on that. The point is, for every answer I give, someone else will have an example of where that answer is not correct or can be countered with something else. I actually think the answer is, the question is entirely wrong. It seems to suggest that just putting hours in is enough to say, if I go on the court and do 3 hours per day, every day from the age of 6 to the age of 16, I will be a professional tennis player. No chance that that statement alone can be correct. Why? Because that's just talking about quantity. The actual real thing to say is, what level of quality do I have to achieve at certain stages of my development in order that I can become a professional tennis player? And even there, arguably, we can say, straight away I can think of Sabalenka, Leylah Fernandez, where apparently at stages through their development, they were rejected by their federations as you're not going to be good enough. So actually you could even argue and say, for every kid that shows a quality stage at age 13, 14, how many of those have gone along to do nothing versus the kids, Dan Evans here in the UK, I read about when he was developing, he said, I didn't feel, something akin to, I didn't feel like I was the best in the group. In fact, I was probably the worst, but I kind of knew I was going to end up being the best. So actually that sort of last little statement is the only kind of real measurement of quality is at a certain age, which for girls, arguably, 15, 16, we see examples of sort of girls appearing on the tours, probably, definitely sort of 17, 18. For the men's side, you're probably looking at more 18, 19, 20 as the ages for when, you'd really be looking to say that's when you might want to be bursting on. Even that statement is incorrect. There are pros who have been late bloomers who've come on the tour quite late. The real point there is it's a question of quality. So here's an example. You start at 6. You go into tennis, you start doing it, and you show some sort of knack for it. You start playing some mini tennis tournaments. You start winning. And all of a sudden, the parent, maybe the coach goes to the parents and say, look, they might be quite good at tennis. The parent looks at them and goes, they seem to be good at this. And all of a sudden, whether it's a derivative of Richard Williams with the Williams sister type story, where you say, there's actually form in this sport that you can individually, with basically no assistance or help, yourself as a parent or a relative or the family, develop a tennis player into a professional who can be a Grand Slam champion. There is absolute form for that. The point being that in principle, anybody can do this. So you sort of become that player at maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, where people go, this kid's got something. Same as all the other hundreds of thousands of kids around that age that have got something that get them into this sport and which is necessary. That's not a cynical statement. That's a sort of necessary step. And what do? They start going on and saying, well, let's put them into coaching. And then I'm going to go on court and I'm going to be hand feeding them. I'm going to get them playing lots of tournaments, lots of little mini tennis tournaments at the weekend. And all of a sudden they start going, do you know what? Maybe if we do more and more and more hours, because there seems to be this sort of general feel that tennis players who do well are the ones that put in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of hours, all from when they were 6 till when they turned pro. People start going, let's do lots of hours. But then comes that question, like I put at the start, which is, how many hours should we be doing? Because of course then people get warned about doing too many hours, about burnout, about stress on the body, about injuries, about fatigue, about, doing too much, and they start saying, well, I've got to do some and I've got to do enough, but I don't want to do too many, so how much is enough? So let's go back to that example of that sort of 6, 7, 8-year-old who starts playing. And what are you doing if you're going on court for lots and lots of hours? You're drilling. You're drilling the same things over and over and over and over. Now, I will take the example of the serve. So right from an early age, the kids are learning to serve. And what's the serve they learn? Typically, it is not to come and drop and, do the elbow drop, get the racket down, racket on edge, and then the throwing motion. What do? They get up to here, and then the wrist flops back, and they slap the ball. It's really, really common. Again, not a criticism, because the serve is incredibly hard to learn, and to ask a 6 or 7-year-old to learn those mechanics is, it's very, very difficult. Now, what's the problem there? The prioritization seems at a young age to be, in lots of cases, getting the ball in. Because if you get the ball in one more time than your opponent, you will win the point, win enough points. You win if you're playing mini tennis tie breaks or start playing matches, sets, games. That's the purpose of tennis. It is, if you're in the winning game, it's to get the ball in one more time than your opponent and win enough points in games that you win the match. Essentially, it's more important for the outcome as opposed to how you did it. And the theory sort of goes that the longer I practice, the more consistent I should get. Now, take that problem with the serve. If you go on, and from the ages of 6 through, I would argue, till 10 or 11, when people start playing with a proper tennis ball, up until that age, you'll get away with lots of funky technique that works, whether it's on the stage 1, 2, or 3 ball, the red, orange, or green ball. You'll get away with less than ideal technique. Then you get to 11, well, 10, you can start playing proper tennis ball tournaments at 10 and 11 years old, 12. And all of a sudden you find that technique doesn't work, because now you're on a full-size court with a full-size net with a fully pressured tennis ball, and it doesn't work as well as it did on the other balls. But also you start finding it puts greater stress on your body. So whether you get injuries, whether you go and then get a coach and say, well, look, if you're actually going to develop into a tennis player, you need to change that serve. You need to change that Western forehand. You need to fix the footwork so you're not just doing a bunty backhand. You suddenly find out that stuff has got to change. Essentially, you've invested all this time to develop less than ideal technique. Now, that's not everyone. You will get some kids out there who, it's like you see YouTube videos of these kids hitting the most amazing technique at sort of 6 years old, and it's like, this person's the next best thing. The hours there are basically, all they've done is absolutely baked in a lack of quality. You could go the other way and say, why don't we go really slow and look at quality? And you could argue 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's 5 years. You could spend, arguably a year on the serve, a year on the forehand, a year on the backhand, a year on the return, and probably add in some volleys there. You could spend that time dedicated just to developing those shots by the time they hit 10 or 11, they're really, really good. What's the problem with that? What kid is going to want to stand on court for 5 years, never playing tennis, just developing technique? So the conflict there is, you do need them to be playing tennis, because that's where they get their fun from. That's what kids love, whether it's just literally hitting balls, but most of them actually want to play points. Kids are competitive. They want to play tennis. So there you got that dilemma. It's like, what comes first, chicken or egg? So what I would argue there is to say, it's more important, I would argue, to focus on quality while investing enough hours to get that done, such that you allow them to be able to play tennis and develop their love for it, and then say, I am willing to invest the time because I want to get better. By the time they hit 11, 12, 13, that's when they're probably starting to get serious. They're starting to make a decision. Is this what I want to do? There are plenty of examples of players who didn't specialize in tennis until they were, a little bit older. and sort of then decided this is what I was going to do. And even players who didn't start until they were sort of 10, 11 years old, didn't even pick up a racket. So the point there is, probably you've got some significant stages, which the first one is when they first start playing tennis, which I'm not sure if it's true, but I've read that Federer didn't start hitting a tennis ball till he was 8. I don't know if that's true. You get, I think of like Lucia Bronzetti, who apparently didn't start till she was 10. John Isner didn't start till he was 11. Shelton didn't specialise in tennis till he was 12, albeit he had an ex-professional tennis player as a father. I would argue there are stages which are the point at which you start and decide you actually want to do this on a regular basis, as in even doing it on a weekly basis to say I'm participating in tennis. You've then probably got 10 or 11 years old, where that's the age where probably for most kids, I think they start to really understand, probably more like 11, they start to understand what it would actually mean to become a tennis player, when they become really sort of conscious of this life I'm going to have. I don't think kids really have that pre-11. They might say, oh yeah, I dream of being a tennis player, but I don't think they really start making those decisions maybe until 11 plus. And then I think you've got probably 14, 15, and that's the age where kids kind of say, I fully get now that I'm going to have to invest in this to take it to the next level, or actually, you know what, I don't want to do that. So arguably what you've got to say is you've got to get kids to each of those stages with enough quality to enable them to push on to the next stage. You could argue that so long as you've developed the fundamentals of tennis, so you understand some of the basic sort of the movements, your muscles have developed in a way that supports the basic movements of tennis. You have sort of a basic understanding of the footwork, the movement, the timing, and maybe, you've got to at least sort of watch tennis to sort of get this idea of strategy, even if you put that in place on an infrequent basis. I would argue that at 14, 15, you could still pick up then. And your body is basically conditioned to allow you to say at 14, 15, you could probably then go in, start training 20, 30 hours a week, and arguably you could still make it as a pro. I understand back in the days in the 90s, that's what a guy called Michael Stich did. He did play sort of foundational tennis, got the foundations of it at a young age, focused on football, and I understand it wasn't until he was 16, when he saw Becker won Wimbledon, that he then said, I'm going to become a tennis pro, and really trained at it. I don't know what he was doing before then, but it seems like there was a significant shift at a relatively late age. So back to that question, how many hours? Well, we know it's not 0. It's got to be more than 0. We know it's not 168, which is 7 times 24 hours. That's impossible. So where is it? What's the number of hours? Well, there is no answer. Because even if I said it's 10 hours or 15 hours, what does that mean? What's an hour on a tennis court? So for one person, an hour means I walk on the court, spend 5 minutes just, putting my trainers on, tying my laces, having a chat to my coach. We then warm up for 10 minutes, and now we're 15 minutes in. We then take a break for 5 minutes. Then we'll hit forehands at 50%, take a break, hit backhands at 50%. Then we sort of sit down, pick up the balls and take a bit of a rest, hit serves, and then for the last 5 minutes we chat about, a game we saw on TV. Versus, player comes on, they've already warmed up before the session, everything's ready, they're ready to go. Second they walk on, they then just hit solidly for an hour. That's 2 very different hours, right? So arguably, is this 1 hour, example A, or is example B, is that equivalent to 3 hours? So straight away there, you've got an example where hours are not a good metric. I would say, and I think it's pretty well, recommended, a few things. One is, you can't just drill. It's the same as you can't just go on a ball machine. Drilling and ball machines develop one thing only, really, or 2 things, which are your technique and your timing. And you could argue probably positioning. What they don't really develop is footwork, movement, agility, the conditioning, unless you're doing real sort of dynamic drilling. And even then, you're still kind of aware what's coming, so I'd argue it's not real sort of true world. It can't just be playing matches. you really, some people might argue and say, yes, you could just play matches every day and you'd learn tennis. I would say even in there, no, you've got to be learning something. You've got to be working on some sort of technique. Brad Gilbert, I suppose, winning ugly, he would, I think he acknowledged himself, he wasn't the prettiest tennis player, so maybe you could just play matches. It can't just be, the 10 or 15 hours with a racket in your hand. You've got to watch tennis. You've got to know what it is. You've got to learn from people that you watch. You've got to kind of develop that strategy. Unless you are just, a Mozart-like genius where you just pick up a racket and you don't need to look at a thing and you're just like, wow, that person never existed. People might think of Federer. Federer will say himself that he watched and learned tennis continuously. And I think he would say, you just didn't see the work I put in the background. It can't just be fitness. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to do fitness all the time and very little time on court. It's got to be a mix of everything. And also, it can't just be tennis. You typically say you really do need to be doing other sports, whether it's football, whether it's athletics, whether you're a Kyrgios playing basketball, for example, whether you're Ben Shelton. I understand that he was more interested in American football, probably where he got that service action from. The point being that you can't really stipulate the hours. It does have to be a mix of activities. And I think the other thing that's pretty well acknowledged is that you have to be acutely aware of the stress and strain that any physical exercise puts on your body, your development, your growth. So I understand really rigorous exercise for really long amounts of time in growing children can actually stunt their growth, But you can get into all sorts of problems, whether it's knees, whether it's elbows, shoulders, wrists, whether it's backs. You think serving is a twisting and bending motion, you end up with the curved spine, whether you end up with that classic sort of tennis drop of the shoulder. All of those things, and not then forgetting the mental, the emotional stress, the stress on families, the stress on finances, all of these things, no matter how much you say, we are not going to be that family, we are going to stick through this. I can tell you already, we're not doing hundreds and hundreds of hours of tennis. My oldest daughter is doing a reasonable amount of hours on the court. But I tell you what, we're not homeschooling her. We're not doing 4 hours a day every single day. We're not doing that. We are giving her days off. So I can tell you right now, there are people who are going to be doing more than us, and already we feel the stress and strain. It gets very emotional sometimes. Fortunately, I think we have a very good bond as a family that we can work it out and kind of say, do you know what? And we've kind of said, number one priority in life is family. Number two is health and well-being. Number three, education. As far as I'm concerned, it's really important that all of our children get at least to, in the UK, college level, which will be 18, so pre-university, so whether it's GCSEs and A levels, so that you got your ticket, that even if then you go off and say they get to the point of being able to play ITFs and go away for a year on a gap year or two, if it doesn't work out that they make money, they can come back and go to university. To me, that's fundamental. Then after all of those things, then tennis. We're not going to compromise on those things, because the one thing that we statistically know, to make money in tennis, albeit I think the ATP now have guaranteed salaries for, I think it's up to 250, it might be up to 300 in the world. I don't think WTA have done that yet. But I think most people would say, unless you're really in the top 100 consistently for 5-6 years plus, you're not really making money from this sport. So if you say the top 100, how many new entrants are there to the top 100 every single year? Well, it can't be that many, because a lot of that top 100 seem to remain exactly the same. And even then, you've got players who aren't it's not like you got the top 100 and then it's a bunch of 16-year-olds. Even people that enter in the top 100 could be, mid to late 20s for the first time. The bottom line is there are very few spaces on offer that make this a viable, financially viable means to live. So unless you're sort of Jessica Pegula or someone like Emma Navarro or Taylor Fritz, who I think all came from very, very wealthy families, although I should imagine they'll tell you, well, we didn't get any freebies, thank you very much, we had to make our own way. For most people, you absolutely need money. You need money to travel, you need money to book hotels, to eat, to develop as a player, and not only then to think, well, I've got to have a life after this. You know, I've got to go and, if I want a family, I've got to have a house, I've got to pay the bills, and so on and so forth. The point is, there are way more players developing, trying to become professionals than there are spots available. So for me, unless you are just, absolutely, we are doing this. We're betting everything. We don't care about what it does to the family. We don't care what it does to the health. We don't care what it does to the education. We're doing it because my belief is that's what you need to do. It's all or nothing. Well, I bet you still there's more than 100 kids with 100 families doing that, So even then, the numbers are ridiculously small. That makes it sound scary. To give a little bit of hope, I played tennis with a good friend who grew up in Spain. He's Spanish, so of course he grew up in Spain. He was training to be going towards what could have been a professional. He grew up playing with Feliciano Lopez. And actually my friend was 12, he beat Feliciano Lopez when Feliciano Lopez was 11 in the final of a tournament in Madrid. At that point, I think Feliciano Lopez went off to Barcelona to some academies and my friend didn't. And I asked him, I said, well, what was Feliciano Lopez like? Was he training like all these hours a week? Was he really hardcore? And he said, not really, no. Yeah, I think it gave the appearance of he was a little bit more laid back, maybe didn't train super hard, but what he did say was he actually was very well, I don't know gifted is the right word, but he was a bit of a natural, So that hopefully sort of gives a bit of a counter to us thinking, wow, if there are all these parents doing 1 million hours a week and I'm not one of those, well, we may as well give up. I think actually let's go back to the question, which is, shouldn't be how many hours a week does my child have to do to become a pro? Shouldn't even be a question of quality. It should be actually, what is the minimum we need to achieve from this to feel like we've been successful? Now, I would say, what could you hopefully guarantee by doing this? If you do invest, even if you put in 5 hours a week, every single week, and you actually choose to do that with quality, you will become a good tennis player. You will become a good tennis player. You don't need to do hundreds of hours to become a good tennis player who's probably going to play regional to national level. If you really sort of pick it up, even that could be enough to sort of touch on, the outlines of something a bit higher. Is it going to be enough to be a pro? Maybe not. I don't know. There may be an example of someone who's done that. You might need to think about doubling that. As a things we have seen. I read about Kyrgios was doing something like 10 to 12 hours a week on court, plus gym, plus he was playing basketball. That's the training he was doing, apparently. Point there though is, even a relatively small amount of hours will get you to the point where you can become a decent enough player. And actually, what could you argue is the point of doing this? Tennis is sport. And I was watching Tim Henman on Sky Sports talk about Coco Gauff in the US Open. I think her second round match where she was crying, right? Because she was so, I guess, stressed, the serve wasn't working, and he's saying, the stress she must be facing going on court and wondering if you can get the serve in. And he said, it's not really right, is it? It's not really right, is it? This is a sport. It should be enjoyable. It's a pastime, And I think that is actually the fundamental. It sounds, sometimes a bit corny when people go around and say, oh, as long as you take part, as long as you have fun, and that kind of insults the competitive side to us, which says, well, no, I'm here to win, So I'd actually turn around and say, the point at which, personally, I feel tennis becomes satisfying is when you can walk onto a court, play tennis in a way that you feel, I actually feel like I'm doing it like it's supposed to be done. It feels right when I play, and I can win, and I feel like I can win at a level where people are saying, you're good, You're beating people who are good. that's probably somewhere between county and regional level. You know, that doesn't have to be international. It's where you are moving out of local and you're getting in sort of regional type level where you're saying you're actually a pretty good player. That becomes satisfying. Now, that doesn't mean people should just aim for that and say, well, that's it, I'm done. But at minimum, you should be saying, if I do nothing else, what is it I want from this? And I think it should be to say, you can't guarantee, if you're under 14s, there is no guarantee you can have at all that you will continue doing this at 15, 16, 17, 18 or beyond. You just don't know this bit of your life that's going to come. Girlfriends, boyfriends, going out, partying, having a life, suddenly looking at your friends going out and saying, I'm on the court all the time, they're out having fun, I don't want to do this anymore. You simply can't plan for that. So I think you've got to kind of be saying, what is it, if I do nothing beyond the age of 14, what is it I want to achieve? And for me personally, I know this, that as a kid, I never learned tennis and I left unsatisfied. And fair enough, I come back into it, but for me, it's to say, at the very least, learn to play tennis. Learn that skill. Learn that so that you can, if you want, you can walk away, but feel at any point, you know, I could rock up and play a tournament and, you know what, I can play tennis. I can pick it up later on if I want. I think at minimum then, you don't sort of get through and think, well, I spent all these hours on court, I ended up with this pancakey serve and this sort of Western forehand and this pushy backhand. I won lots of matches. I gave up at 15 because life came along and I wanted to do other things. And I look back and think, I didn't even really learn tennis properly, did I? You know? And then you kind of go, why did I do that? You know, what was the point? Now, that does sound quite cynical. But even in that, you know, that's my opinion, isn't it? We've gone well away from the original question, how many hours should you spend on the court? The answer is, it is the number of hours that you are willing to invest to enjoy this as a sport, as a pastime, develop to the level of quality that doesn't inhibit your development as you decide to become more and more serious, but probably is to say it should be ultimately down to your child when they become old enough and mature enough to say, if I do more and it means that there are impacts on my body, my health, my relationships, I am prepared to accept that. So I won't live with regret rather than feeling like I had a pushy parent that made me do something. I don't know if I've actually answered anything or made any points of relevance or interest there at all, but I'm going to stop there because it's quite clear I'm not going to tell you, here's how many hours, because the answer is, I don't know, nor does anybody else.